The irrigation line on the east side had been making a sound for 3 nights. Not a loud sound, just a low, irregular knock, like a pipe with air trapped inside. Darren Cole had told himself he would check it in the morning. Then morning came, and the grain needed turning, and the storage unit needed its filters cleaned, and the knock became one of those things a man learns to sleep through. But on the fourth night, it was not the knock that woke him. It was breathing. He lay still for a moment, listening through the dark of his room. The window was cracked open. Cool air moved the curtain. The breathing was not close. It was out past the field, near the tree line, but it was heavy and wet and uneven in a way that made the back of his neck prickle. Not a machine, not wind moving through the stalks, something alive, something big, and something in pain. Darren sat up. He pulled on his work boots without untying them, grabbed his lamp, and went outside. The wheat stood chest high along the east field. The lamp threw a yellow circle around him as he walked, the stalks brushing his arms. He followed the sound first. Then he found the trail. Dark fluid, nearly black in the lamplight, cut across 3 rows of flattened grain. Whatever had come through low and dragging. The broken stalks pointed east, toward the tree line. That he followed the trail. He was not thinking yet. His feet were moving before his mind had caught up. The trees at the edge of his property were old, thick-trunked, the kind that had been there before the colony was settled. At their base, between 2 large roots that jutted from the ground like arms, he found them. The large one was pressed against the roots with its side, one wing spread at an angle that was clearly wrong. The wing membrane was torn along the upper edge, a wide gash that had soaked the feathers below it black with dried blood and still seeped at the deepest point. It was a dragon. Darren knew the shape. Varek, they were called in the colony records, though most people on Ardenvale had never seen one closer than a distant shape in the upper sky. Crimson scales, darkened now with blood and dirt. Amber eyes that found him immediately and did not look away. Beneath it, pressed into the shelter of its body, was a smaller one. Gray-silver scales, one foreleg bent at the wrong angle, the joint swollen to nearly twice its natural size. Young. The small one was making a sound, barely a sound, more like a vibration, that Darren felt in his back teeth rather than heard with his ears. The large one snarled. It was not a sound a person forgot. It came from deep in the chest, layered with harmonics that did not belong to anything Darren had heard in his 51 years. She tried to rise. Her legs pushed against the root and the ground, but the torn wing unbalanced her, and she came down hard on her good side with a sound that was equal parts fury and pain. Darren did not run. He stood where he was and watched her try to rise again. She couldn't. The effort cost her, and she knew it. The amber eyes were still fixed on him, still burning, still promising very bad things if he came one step closer. That he looked at the wing, then at the small one's foreleg, then back at the wing. That he reached into his jacket pocket and took out his comm unit. He held it up so she could see it clearly. Then he set it down on the ground in front of him, screen side up, still lit. She watched the comm unit. Then she watched him. He held up both hands, open, and took one slow step back. Then he turned and walked back to the farmhouse. He did not go fast. Running felt like the wrong thing. He walked at a normal pace like a man heading in for coffee, and he kept his hands out of his pockets until he was back on the porch. Inside, he went to the storage room. He pulled out the field medic kit he had not opened in 11 years, since before Nora died, since before the farm became the whole world. He checked the saline pouches, still good. Bandage roll, clamps, suture line, irrigation tube. He added a wool blanket from the shelf. He lit the second lamp. That he thought about what he was doing for exactly 4 seconds. Then he picked everything up and went back out into the dark. The amber eyes found him again the moment he cleared the tree line. The snarl came again, lower this time, a warning rather than a threat. The small one had gone quiet, watching him with eyes that were more curious than afraid. Darren stopped at the same distance as before. He set the kit down, opened it slowly, and held up the saline pouch. He did not know if she understood what it was. He suspected she did. She did not snarl again. He took that as permission. That he moved slowly, and he talked the whole time. Not because he thought she could understand the words, but because silence felt dangerous, and a voice, even a stranger's voice, had a shape that a frightened creature could track. He talked about the irrigation line. He talked about the hard frost 2 weeks back. He talked about Nora and the way she used to say the East Field had better soil than the West Field, which was true, and which he still thought about each planting season. The large dragon watched every movement of his hands. She did not stop him. Getting them into the barn took half an hour. Darren did not push. He made an offer, not a demand. He walked to the barn, opened both wide doors so the light spilled out onto the ground, and came back to the tree line. Then he waited. The large dragon, the crimson one, watched the open doors for a long time without moving. The small one had pressed its nose against Darren's first aid kit and was sniffing it with enormous focus, as if the smell of saline was the most interesting thing in the world. Eventually, the crimson one moved. She did it in stages, testing each step before committing to it. The torn wing dragged. She hated that. Darren could tell she hated it the way a person with pride hates needing help. Not with anger, exactly, but with a kind of tightly held stillness, like she was daring him to comment, that he did not comment. The small one followed close against her side, favoring the swollen foreleg, hopping slightly on every third step. Inside the barn, Darren cleared the center space and spread the blanket across the floor. The crimson one stood in the middle of the barn and looked at everything. Every corner, the hayloft, the equipment along the walls. She looked at Darren last, and for a long time that he sat down on a hay bale with the kit open beside him and waited. She turned her head away first. That was permission. He had learned that much already. The wing was the serious problem. The tear ran almost 30 centimeters along the upper membrane edge, where the leading bone supported the span. It had partially clotted, but the deepest section was still seeping. Darren cleaned it with saline, working slowly, rinsing rather than scrubbing. She made a sound once, a single short note that dropped at the end, and he stopped moving completely until she settled again. Dragon anatomy was not human anatomy. He knew that. The membrane was tougher than it looked, almost leathery near the bone, thinner toward the trailing edge. He used the irrigation tube to brace across the tear. Rather than trying to suture skin, he was not sure his needle could penetrate cleanly. It was rough work. Functional, he hoped, but rough. He wrapped it with the bandage roll in long, overlapping passes, keeping the tension even, checking twice that the bone underneath had no give when he pressed gently. The crimson one did not bite him. She watched every movement of his hands with those amber eyes. Once near the end of the wrapping, she turned her head and looked directly at his face, and he had the very clear and slightly unsettling feeling of being assessed. He held her gaze and kept working. The small one was easier and harder at the same time. Easier because she was less guarded, more willing to let him close. Harder because she made sounds, small, high sounds at the back of her throat, when he touched the swollen foreleg, and those sounds were difficult to sit with. He used fence slats from the repair pile in the corner, 2 of them, patting them with folded cloth before he strapped them into place with medical wrap. He worked as fast as he could without working sloppy. When the splint was set and the tension on the joint was relieved, the small dragon made a different sound. Low, steady, a hum that started in her chest and moved outward. The pain was less. He could tell. She turned her head and pushed her nose against his forearm. Not hard, just a brief solid pressure. He sat very still and let her. Then he stood, collected the used materials, and made himself coffee on the small burner he kept at the barn workbench for long repair nights. He poured it into a tin cup and sat back down on the hay bale with 6 feet between himself and the dragons. He was tired. He had been tired before he went to bed, and the night had not improved that. He drank his coffee and talked for a little while about nothing, really just filling the air. And somewhere in the middle of a sentence about the Westfield drainage problem, he ran out of words and ran out of wakefulness at the same time. He fell asleep sitting upright, the cup still loosely in his hand. He did not hear it tip over when his hand relaxed. The crimson one had not slept. She lay with her legs folded beneath her, which was not rest. Exactly. It was a position that allowed fast movement if fast movement became necessary. She watched the human sleep. She watched the rise and fall of his breathing. She watched his hands, which were open and still. She had old scars on her flanks under the new blood. Long, straight marks that had nothing natural about them. Scars from something that had taught her what hands reaching toward her usually meant. These hands had held saline and bandage wrap. She did not understand the human. He had set down his comm unit before approaching. He had sat down instead of standing over her. He had talked the entire time in a low, even voice with no commands in it. She lowered her head to the floor, not fully resting, but no longer ready to strike. Across the barn, the small one was already asleep, curled into a tight circle with the splinted leg tucked carefully inward. Her breathing was slow and even. The pain had eased enough for sleep, and sleep, for the young, comes fast. The Crimson One watched the human until her own eyes grew heavy. She did not look away until she had to. The I-Core trail in the east field was visible from the road. Darren had not thought about that. He had been thinking about wounds and splints and keeping two frightened creatures calm through a long night. And he had not thought about the fact that 3 rows of flattened wheat and a line of dark staining cutting toward his tree line was exactly the kind of thing a neighbor on a morning walk would notice. His neighbor Pell noticed it before the sun was fully up by midday. Counselor Bryn Holt arrived at the gate with 2 deputies behind him and the particular expression of a man who had been asked to deal with something he did not want to deal with. Holt was not a bad man. Darren had known him for 9 years, since Darren first came to Ardenvale and filed his land claim. Holt processed paperwork, managed water allocation disputes, and attended every colonial meeting with the careful energy of someone who wanted no one to be unhappy with him. He was good at his job. His job was not built for this. Darren met him at the gate. "Morning, Bran." "Darren." Holt looked past him toward the barn, then at the east field, then back. "You know why I'm here. I expect Edo." Pell saw the trail. He called it in. Under the colony charter, any sighting of an unregistered sentient species on private land has to be reported within 24 hours and the subjects transferred to interspecies authority custody within 72. Holt said all of this in the tone of a man reciting something he had memorized because he did not entirely agree with it. That window started when Pell filed the report this morning. "So technically you have until tomorrow morning." Darren nodded. "Are they on your property?" "I found some injured wildlife out by the tree line," Darren said. "I brought them in for the night. I haven't confirmed what species they are. I'll file a report when I have something to report." Holt looked at him. The 2 deputies looked at each other. "Darren, that's where I am right now, Bren. Unconfirmed wildlife. I'm a careful man. I don't file reports on things I haven't confirmed. If they are Varek," Holt said carefully, "and if you knowingly shelter them past the 72-hour window without authorization, that is a Class 2 violation. That means an automatic review of your farming license. Possible suspension. Possible relocation order." He paused. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you because I'd rather you made an informed decision." "I appreciate that," Darren said. "I'll keep it in mind." He thanked Holt for coming out. He shook both deputies' hands. He watched all 3 of them drive back down the road, and then he latched the gate and walked to the barn. The small one, Elias, he had started calling her in his head, though he did not know if she had a name, had found the grain trough he had filled with dried protein rations. She was eating with complete focus, her tail moving slowly side to side with the rhythm of it. The Crimson One was standing near the far wall, watching the crack between the barn doors. She had been watching since the vehicles pulled up. Darren got his coffee and sat on the hay bale and looked at the Crimson One for a moment. "You heard that," he said. She turned her head. "I don't know if you understood the words, but I think you understood the shape of it." He drank his coffee. "That was a man telling me there's a cost for keeping you here. I want you to know it was a cost I'd already decided to pay before he opened his mouth." The Crimson One held his gaze. Her amber eyes did not move. "I'm not telling you so you'll feel grateful," Darren said. "You don't owe me anything. I'm telling you because it felt like the honest thing to do." He went back to work. There were still filters to clean on the storage unit, and the west drainage channel needed its monthly check, and the irrigation knock had not fixed itself. The day had the same number of tasks it always had. He moved through them. Late in the afternoon, he came back to the barn to check Lys's splint. The joint was less swollen. She let him touch it without pulling away, and when he straightened up, she pushed the top of her head against his chest once, firmly, Like a period at the end of a sentence, he stood there with his hand resting lightly on her neck for a moment. Then he heard a sound behind him. He turned. The Crimson One had crossed the barn. She was standing 4 feet away from him, closer than she had ever voluntarily come. She was looking at LYSS, then at him, then at the door. Then she walked to the grain trough and ate. She did not look at him while she did it. She kept her eyes down, focused on the food, very carefully not acknowledging him in any direction. But she ate. Darren understood something about pride. He had enough of his own to recognize it in something else. He turned away and gave her the privacy of the moment. Outside, the sun was getting low. He had fields to check. He had a report he was not going to file. He did both in that order. By the 5th day, LYSS had decided that Darren was the most interesting thing on the property. She followed him everywhere. Down the fence line when he checked posts. Into the storage shed when he rotated the grain stock. Around the side of the farmhouse when he cleared the drainage grate. She walked 3 steps behind him at all times, her splinted foreleg barely slowing her, her silver-gray head turning left and right to examine everything he touched. She investigated the irrigation unit by pressing her nose into every joint and seam until the knock, the one Darren had been meaning to fix for a week, was located in a crack coupling near the east connection point. She did not fix it. She sneezed on it, then looked at Darren as though she had done him a significant favor. "Thank you," he said. He replaced the coupling. She watched him work with the focus of someone learning a new language, which Darren supposed was exactly what was happening. By the end of the day, she had learned that he stopped moving when she pushed against him too hard, which meant he wanted her to move back. She had learned that a flat hand meant stay. She had learned that when he crouched down to her level and tilted his head, it was a question he was learning too. The low hum meant she was content. The rapid blink meant she was uncertain. When her tail curled in at the tip, she was tired. The Crimson One, Sarah, he had started calling her, though he never said it out loud, kept her distance from all of this. She had claimed the back third of the barn, where the light was lower and the wall was solid behind her. She slept there. She ate when Darren filled the trough, and he had stepped away. She watched everything from that shadow, without appearing to watch anything. On the 6th morning, Darren was replacing a loose board on the south side of the barn when he noticed the scar. He had seen the old marks on Sarah's flanks before. Long, straight lines beneath her scales that caught the light wrong. He had noted them and moved on because there had been fresh wounds to deal with, and the old ones were healed. But this morning, with the barn door open and the early light coming in at a low angle, he saw 3 more on her shoulder that he had missed in the dark. Perfectly parallel. Perfectly even in their spacing. Those were not fight scars. He sat down on the barn floor with his knees up and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Someone had cut her. Deliberately. With something precise. And not just once. He did not say anything about it. There was nothing to say that would mean anything to her. He went back to the loose board and finished replacing it. And the sound of the hammer was steady and ordinary, and he made sure it stayed that way. That evening, he sat on the old chair outside the barn with his book, a paper one, which Nora had always found ridiculous, but paper held up better than screens in a working farm environment, and he read aloud. He had started doing this 2 evenings ago because the silence outside after sunset felt large, and a voice filled it without demanding anything from the creatures inside. He was 3 pages into a chapter about colonial water law. Genuinely not interesting, but it was what he had. When he heard movement behind him he did not turn around, the sound settled. Something large was on the ground behind him, a weight and a warmth he could sense without seeing. He kept reading. His voice stayed even. He turned the page. He estimated she was about 12 feet behind him. He read for another 40 minutes before his eyes gave out. He closed the book and said good night to the dark in general. And he went inside. In the morning, there were claw marks in the soft ground near the chair. She had been close enough that he could have reached out and touched her. If he had turned around, he had not turned around. He understood, in the way a man with scars of his own understands, that trust was not a thing you handed to someone. It was a thing they built space for, and then waited and let you come to on your own time. He had not turned around because turning around would have been the wrong move. It would have said that he was watching her, measuring her, waiting to see what she did. He was not watching her. He was just there, The 72-hour window had passed 3 days ago. He had not filed the report. His comm unit showed 2 missed calls from Counselor Holt's office number and one from a line he did not recognize with an interspecies authority prefix. He had not returned any of them. He set the comm unit face down on the kitchen counter and went out to check on the irrigation line. LYSS was already there, sitting beside the coupling he had replaced, looking at it with tremendous satisfaction. "It's still holding," he told her. She hummed. He crouched down and tilted his head at her, which by now she knew meant a question. She tilted hers back. "How's the leg?" She lifted it and set it down twice. Evenly, no hop this time. He allowed himself a small exhale of relief. Then he stood up and they walked the fence line together in the quiet morning, the farmer and the dragon, and neither of them needed the walk to be anything more than what it was. The vessel came in low from the northeast, and it was not quiet about it. Darren heard it before he saw it, a deep displacement of air, a pressure change that made the loose barn door rattle. He was at the workbench repairing a broken seed drill when LYSS's head came up sharply, her ears flat, the hum she usually made going completely silent. He had learned that silence from her was more alarming than noise, that he stepped outside. The ship was angular and dark, with wing structures that folded back along its body like a bird landing. It was not large by military standards, but it was larger than anything Ardenvale's colonial registry permitted to land within settlement boundaries without prior clearance. It came down in the east field, slowly and deliberately, and it crushed 4 rows of late-season grain with the precision of something that knew exactly how much space it was taking and did not particularly care. Darren stood with his arms at his sides and watched it settle. The ramp came down. The figure who walked out first was armored in dark plate that caught no light. Behind her came 4 others, similarly armored, carrying equipment that Darren did not need to identify to understand. The lead figure stopped at the edge of the field. She was Varric, taller than Sara by a head, leaner, with dark gray scales and a bearing that was entirely composed of right angles. Darren walked out to meet her. He had not changed out of his work clothes. He did not go back for anything. They stopped 10 feet apart. "This is a private property," Darren said. "I am Captain Vora Desh of the 4th Varric Scout Division." Her translation unit rendered the words in flat, clear colonial standard. "We are tracking 2 Varric nationals who were separated from their unit 14 days ago in a territorial incident. Our scanners show 2 Varric life signs on this property. You will return them to my custody immediately." "They're healing," Darren said. The adult's wing was torn through the membrane and still needs another week of rest before it will hold weight under flight stress. The juvenile's foreleg joint was shattered. The swelling is down, but the bone is still knitting. Vora looked at him for a moment. "You treated them." "I did. You're a licensed medical practitioner." "I'm a farmer. I was a field medic before that." He met her eyes. "I used what I had, and I used it carefully." The 4 soldiers behind her had not moved. Vora turned her head and said something in Varric, and one of them lowered the equipment they were holding. "I would like to see them," Vora said. "That's up to them," Darren said. He turned and walked back to the barn, and he left it up to her whether she followed. She followed. He opened the barn doors wide. Inside, Sara was standing at the back wall, which Darren recognized as her defensive position. She had heard the ship. She had heard the voices. She had not run. Her wings were tight against her body, and her eyes were on the door. LYSS was pressed against Darren's left side with her whole body, a wall of warm scales, and she did not move away from him when Vora stepped inside. Vora stopped in the middle of the barn. She looked at Sara. Then she looked at the bandaged wing, the healing lines on the membrane, the clean wrap on LYSS's foreleg. She looked at the grain trough, which had food in it, at the blanket on the floor, which both dragons used, though Sara would never admit to it. She said something in Varric. Sara answered. It was the first time Darren had heard Sara's voice used for actual language, and even without understanding a word of it, he could hear the weight and precision in it. It went on for almost a minute. Vora's translation unit was not broadcasting. He could not hear what was said. When Sara finished, Vora turned and looked at Darren with an expression that he could not read. He was still very new at reading Varric faces, but which felt in some way he could not justify, like reassessment. "What did she say?" he asked. Vora was quiet for a moment. Then she said you did not have to. She said you chose to. Another pause. She also said you never turned around. Darren was not sure what to do with that. So he nodded. Vora looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the silence started to have weight. I was given no protocols for this, she said finally. It sounded less like a complaint than an honest statement of a problem she had not anticipated. I'm not asking for protocols, Darren said. I am aware of that. She looked back at Sarah, then at LYSS, who had not moved from Darren's side. You are in violation of your colonial code. You know this. Ido. You filed no report. You returned no communications. That's right. Vora turned back to him. Outside, he could hear the east field wind picking up. The grain stalks that were still standing made a low, dry sound. The juvenile has bonded to you, she said. Darren looked at LYSS. She looked back at him. I noticed, he said. Vora turned and walked back to the barn door. She stood in the open space for a moment with her back to him, looking at her ship in the field. I will require time to consider the appropriate course of action, she said. There's a chair outside, Darren said. I'll make coffee. She did not answer immediately. Then she said, without turning, I do not drink coffee. I'll make it anyway, Darren said. Ido. A month later, Darren replaced the 3 fence posts that LYSS had destroyed. She had not destroyed them on purpose. She had been helping. Helping, for LYSS, was a concept that arrived with tremendous energy and departed with structural damage. She stood beside him now and watched him drive the new posts into the ground with the kind of sincere, unbothered interest of someone who was completely certain the fence problem had nothing to do with her. You know what happened to the last ones, Darren said. She tilted her head. That's what I thought. Vora had left 11 days ago. She had filed a report with Varek Command describing the situation as a civilian humanitarian contact of diplomatic sensitivity and recommended a non-intervention hold pending further assessment. Her superiors had approved it, apparently, because no one had come back. Darren had received a formal colonial notice 3 days after Vora's departure, informing him that his Class 2 violation review had been suspended. No explanation was given. He did not ask for one. Sarah had not left. She had not explained this. She did not offer explanations for anything she did, which Darren found, on reflection, deeply reasonable. She had simply not boarded the ship when Vora left. Vora had looked at Sarah for a long moment. Sarah had met her eyes and said something brief and final in Varek. Vora had nodded once, slowly, and walked up the ramp without pressing the matter. Sarah now lived in the east pasture. Fully, the way a creature lives somewhere when it has decided. She slept in the same spot each night, near the old tree at the far corner, wings folded, tail curled around her. When Darren worked in the east field, she was there. She was not always near him. Often she was 50 meters away, lying in the grass, looking at the sky. But she was there when strangers drove down the road past the property. She stood, just stood, not threateningly, not in a way that required explanation. She simply rose to her full height and was visible, and strangers tended to keep driving. Counselor Holt had come once more, on a Tuesday, without his deputies this time. He stood at the gate and looked at the east pasture and looked at Darren and said, I see, which was the most honest thing Darren had ever heard him say. Then he drove back to town, and Darren had not heard from him since. The farm was different now in a way that was hard to describe to someone who had not been there for the before. It had the same fields, the same buildings, the same daily work. The difference was in the quality of the quiet. Before, the quiet had been just absence. Now it had company and IT'd in the evenings. Darren still sat in the chair outside the barn with his book. LYSS had taken to curling at his feet for this part of the day, which presented a problem because LYSS was no longer small enough to curl at anyone's feet, and she did not acknowledge this. She would arrange herself with great intention and then look at him as if to confirm that everything was in order, and he would look at the warm, complicated heap of silver gray scales blocking his entire lower half and say that yes, everything seemed fine. That on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after Vora's departure, Darren found something on the porch railing he had not heard anyone approach. His front porch faced the road, and Sarah was in the east pasture, and LYSS was at the water trough. He could hear her, and he had been in the kitchen washing up for dinner. He stepped out to check the sky for weather and saw it there on the railing, propped upright against a post so he would not miss it. Scale, carved, about the length of his hand. The base was dark, polished to smoothness, and into the face of it was cut a pattern that he did not know how to read. Lines and angles, interlocking, precise, but which had the look of something with meaning rather than decoration. The edge was warm when he picked it up, as if it had not been there long. He turned it over in his hands that he looked down the road. Nothing, just the evening light lying long across the grass. That he understood, eventually, what Vora had given him and how she had chosen to give it. He stood on the porch for a while holding the scale, with the dinner getting cold behind him and the first stars starting to show, and he thought about what the last month had cost him and what it had become. He had 4 rows of crushed grain he would have to replant in spring. He had a legal notice he was not going to frame. He had a hole in the east field fence that LYSS had created while helping. He had old scars on his hand from years of farm work and older ones from before, and so did Sarah, and neither of them talked about it, and that was fine. That he went back inside. He ate his dinner. When it was full dark, he took his coffee and the carved scale out to the porch chair. LYSS was at his feet in under a minute, taking up most of the available ground. Sarah was a dark, quiet shape in the east pasture, wings folded, watching the stars the way she always watched them. Like she knew them personally and had not decided yet whether they deserved trust. He held the scale and drank his coffee and said nothing. Some things did not need words. Some things were already carried.